My name is Catherine, and the last thing my mother ever said to me before she shut the door in my face was, "Don't come back. You were never meant to be here." 20 years later, she looked me straight in the eye at my sister's wedding and mocked me like the wound she carved in me had never mattered at all. I thought I had learned to live without her. I didn't know the past was about to break open in front of 100 strangers, or that someone else in that room knew exactly who I really was, and he remembered something my own mother never did, that I was worth saving. The station was settling into that late-night stillness that only comes after hours of adrenaline. The monitors hummed in their steady rhythm, casting soft pulses of light across the walls, and the sharp scent of antiseptic clung to everything I touched. I moved through the hallway, gathering the last of the equipment, feeling the familiar weight of exhaustion in my shoulders. Outside, Santa Fe's darkness pressed against the windows like a quiet reminder that the world kept turning whether I rested or not. I was reaching for my jacket when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it. Calls at that hour rarely carried anything good. But the second I glanced at the screen, my hands froze. Annabeth. A name that belonged to another lifetime. A name that shouldn't have had a reason to appear now. I answered, though my pulse thudded in my ears. Her breath wavered before her voice did. "I'm getting married. I want you there. Napa Valley." The room tightened around me. 20 years of silence, and suddenly she wanted me at a celebration filled with crystal glasses, perfect photos, and a crowd that wouldn't know I existed unless my absence raised questions. I didn't know what stunned me more, the invitation, or the tremor in her voice that sounded almost like hope. I should have said no, but something in me shifted, the old wound tugging open just enough to let a choice slip through. "I'll come." Her exhale cracked at the end, before leaving. I stopped in the restroom and faced the mirror. The woman staring back had survived more than anyone in that family ever cared to know. At sunrise, I drove out of Santa Fe, the long, empty road stretching toward the past I was finally done running from. The farther I drove into the Arizona desert, the more the past insisted on riding beside me. Heat rippled across the pavement in restless waves, bending the horizon so the sky looked like it was melting into the sand. The radio played low, barely loud enough to compete with the dry wind rattling through the cracked window. But it was enough to keep my thoughts from settling, or so I hoped, somewhere between towns with no names. A memory rose without warning. I saw myself at 6, standing barefoot on a cold porch after being pushed outside for waking Annabeth with a nightmare. I remembered pressing my cheek to the door, promising myself I wouldn't cry, because crying only made everything worse. The ache of that night slipped back into my chest now, sharp and cold, even under the desert sun. I tried focusing on the road instead, on the direction I was headed, rather than the one I'd come from. Napa Valley felt impossibly far from this stretch of empty highway. I told myself Annabeth had called because she wanted to, not because someone expected a full family portrait at her wedding. I told myself that until it felt true. It didn't. At a faded gas station off the interstate, I stepped out to stretch. A child's cry snapped my attention toward a little girl who had fallen by the pumps. Her mother rushed in, scooping her close, murmuring comfort in a voice full of instinctive tenderness. The sight tightened something under my ribs. I watched until the ache grew too sharp, then ducked into the convenience store to breathe. When I returned to the truck, the radio flicked on mid-story. The reporter mentioned a major accident in Albuquerque from years ago. A survivor who credited an EMT for keeping him alive until help came. The description hit me hard, twisted metal. Smoke, a pair of terrified eyes locking onto mine. I switched the station quickly, but the memory clung to me long after the sound faded. By sunset, the California border stretched ahead in long shadows. The sky softened into deep orange, and a strange certainty pulsed beneath my ribs. Whatever waited in Napa wasn't just a reunion. Something tied to the past was turning toward me. Sharpened and unavoidable, I kept driving. Napa Valley rose in front of me like a postcard vineyards rolling in perfect lines, golden light catching on every leaf. The Whitmore estate standing high above it all, as if carved out of another world. Inside, guests moved through wide rooms washed in warm light. their laughter polished, their clothes immaculate. I walked in feeling the dust of the road still clinging to me. My mother stood near the center of the room, flawless as always, surrounded by people leaning in just slightly, the way they always had. When her eyes met mine, her expression froze for a split second before smoothing into something unreadable. No greeting, no welcome, just distance sharpened to habit. Annabeth hurried forward and wrapped her arms around me. For a moment, the room faded, then she stepped back, glancing toward our mother, who offered a tight-lipped smile that didn't touch her eyes. That look was enough to remind me exactly where I stood in this family. Dinner on the terrace felt like stepping into a world that had never included me. Lanterns swayed above us, casting soft halos over the tables. A man from the Whitmore side asked what I did for work. When I answered, he nodded politely, but with the detached tone of someone marking a checkbox. Another guest made a comment about ambulances that earned a few polite chuckles. My mother added a remark about me always choosing simple paths. Her tone was sweet. Her intent was anything but. It was then I noticed Daniel standing near the railing, his drink untouched. He wasn't watching the crowd, he was watching me. His brow drawn slightly, as if trying to place a memory that refused to settle. His gaze didn't carry judgment, only recognition. Quiet but certain. When I rose to leave the table, his eyes followed me. My mother saw it too. Her posture tightened. The first crack in her carefully controlled composure. And in that moment, underneath the glow of vineyard lights, something shifted subtle, but so unmistakably real that it left the air colder against my skin. Something was beginning. Morning settled over Napa, with a thin chill that clung to the vines behind the house. I slipped outside before anyone else was awake, hoping the quiet rows of grapes might soften the heaviness still lingering from last night. The wind moved through the leaves in steady waves, carrying the scent of damp soil and distant coffee. I breathed it in, thinking I might have a few minutes to myself. Footsteps approached from behind. Daniel stopped beside me, hands tucked into his pockets, eyes avoiding mine as if he were choosing each word before speaking. His voice came low, almost hesitant, asking if he could ask me something unusual. I nodded, already bracing for whatever lay behind the question. He asked if I'd ever lived in Albuquerque. More specifically, if I had been there around 2004. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. Out of every year he could have mentioned, he had chosen the exact one tied to memories I'd never managed to bury completely. I gave the smallest nod, and something flickered across his face, a spark of recognition so sharp it made the world around us narrow. He began describing the accident, the SUV rolling, fuel leaking, smoke thickening inside the cabin, his leg pinned under the dashboard. His voice didn't shake, but the memory lived raw beneath every word. Then he said he remembered someone reaching him, keeping him awake, pulling him out moments before the vehicle ignited. He remembered a voice telling him to stay with her, to look at her, to hold on. I could barely breathe. Before either of us spoke again, my mother's voice cut through the air, sharp and almost desperate. She marched toward us, calling his name with a brightness that didn't match the tension etched across her face. She placed herself between us, insisting the past wasn't worth digging up. Her tone brittle beneath the sweetness she tried to force. Daniel looked at her with growing suspicion. I understood then she wasn't afraid of me remembering anything. She was terrified of him remembering everything. Annabeth appeared just as our mother dragged Daniel toward the house, her fingers digging into his arm hard enough to make him wince. She watched them disappear around the corner, then turned back to me with wide, unsettled eyes. She asked if our mother was hiding something from me. For the first time, she wasn't standing on our mother's side. And the shift was so sudden, so fragile, it felt like the ground beneath us had begun to tilt. Night pressed in heavy around the resort, warm lights glowing against the dark hallways as I returned to my room. The quiet didn't ease anything. If anything, it made the air feel tighter. I could hear my mother's voice rising from the room across the hall, sharp and frayed, clashing with Annabeth's confused protests. This wasn't wedding stress. This was fear. I unlocked my door, but before stepping in, the door across the hall opened. My mother stepped out quickly, her expression tight. Her bag slipped from her shoulder, and a folder slid out. Landing at my feet, a man's name stared up at me, a name I had never seen in my life. He wasn't the man who raised me, and he certainly wasn't the man my mother married. She snatched the folder as if burned. I asked who he was. She snapped that it wasn't my concern. The panic in her voice only sharpened the truth. Annabeth emerged behind her, face streaked with tears. I asked again, softer this time, and something inside my mother broke loose. She shouted that I wasn't her husband's child, that I was a mistake she had nearly lost everything over. The world went soundless. Annabeth gasped. My entire childhood reassembled itself in a single, brutal instant. A quiet creak came from the hallway corner. Daniel stepped forward. Having heard every word, he looked at my mother, not with anger, but something worse, disbelief. He asked if she had treated me this way simply to protect her reputation. She flinched as if struck. Then he asked the question that froze the air completely, whether she feared what he might remember about me, or what he might remember about her. Silence thickened around us. No longer emptiness, but pressure. An airless room, closing in on the truth neither of us could escape. Something had cracked open, and there was no closing it again. The night before the wedding, pressed down on the Whitmore estate like a suffocating blanket. No one spoke openly about what had happened earlier. Yet every room felt tightly wound, every whisper clipped short. I stepped outside to the back garden, hoping the cold air might give me a few minutes to breathe. Lantern light flickered across the patio, catching the rim of my glass as I sat alone, listening to the quiet settle in around me. Annabeth found me first. Her voice shook as she asked if I knew anything about my father, something deeper than the fragments we'd grown up with. I could only shake my head. The truth was, I didn't know what I didn't know. The gap in my own history felt like a bruise I'd learned not to touch. Before either of us could speak again, our mother burst into the garden. Fear and anger burned through her composure. She snapped that she'd never been able to admit the truth because I wasn't her husband's child, and she couldn't risk anyone knowing. The words sliced clean through the quiet, and Annabeth stumbled back, crying. I felt myself go still. Not from shock, but from recognition. On some level, I'd always sensed the distance had roots deeper than anything I'd ever done. Then she kept unraveling, admitting she'd destroyed every trace of the man who was my father documents. Photos, anything that tied me to a history she couldn't control. The loss hit harder than her anger ever had. It felt like someone had stolen a life I should have had access to. Daniel stepped through the doorway then. He had heard enough to freeze my mother in place. She tried to dismiss him, insisting it was a private matter. But he didn't move. He asked if her obsession with appearances was truly the reason she'd pushed me aside. She flinched, and he pressed on, saying that if I was the EMT who saved his life in Albuquerque, then what she'd done was more cruel than anything he could have imagined. At the mention of that city, my mother broke. She shouted for him not to bring it up, her voice cracking. That fear told its own truth. She wasn't afraid of the past, she was afraid of losing control over it. When she finally fell silent, trembling, I realized something had shifted permanently. Tomorrow, she would try to reclaim power. And tomorrow, I would no longer let her. The wedding morning looked almost unreal in its beauty. Rows of white chairs lined the vineyard garden, lanterns hung between the vines, and rose petals made a perfect path down the aisle. It should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt staged like a set waiting for the wrong scene to play out. A guest approached me with polite curiosity, asking what I did in New Mexico. I answered. But before I could finish, my mother stepped in, her voice bright and cutting. She dismissed my work in front of everyone, reducing it to something beneath effort, beneath pride. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd, and the shame that followed landed like a stone in my stomach. Then she added that families like the Whitmores couldn't afford poor impressions. Her tone drenched in warning. The meaning was clear. I was an embarrassment. Daniel stepped forward just as the words left her mouth. He didn't raise his voice, but his presence cut through the chatter instantly. He said I was the EMT who saved his life 20 years earlier. The shift in the crowd was immediate. Silence broke over the garden, the laughter dying mid-breath. He told them about the accident, the overturned SUV, the leaking fuel. how I kept him awake and pulled him out before the flames reached him. He remembered my hands, my voice, and the certainty that I wouldn't leave him there to die. He said he wouldn't be alive to marry Annabeth if it weren't for me. My mother tried to speak, but no denial could survive what he had revealed. The guests looked at me with something startling respect. Annabeth covered her mouth, tears running down her face. Daniel stepped to my side, and for the first time in my life, my mother looked small, drowning in a crowd that finally saw the truth she had spent decades trying to bury. The moment Daniel's voice rose above the crowd, the entire garden fell into a stunned and breathless stillness. Lantern light trembled over frozen faces, and even the wind threading through the vines seemed to quiet itself. I stood in the center, caught beneath 100 widened eyes, while my mother hovered nearby, pale and visibly shaking, as if the ground beneath her feet had turned to dust. Daniel looked at me with a steadiness that held the whole space. He said I had saved his life. His voice didn't shake. It carried, clear and undeniable. Then he told them about the accident, the overturned SUV, the leaking fuel, the terror closing in. He repeated the words I'd said to him on that mountainside, words I barely remembered among years of emergencies. "Look at me! Hold on! I'll get you out!" The crowd reacted in soft gasps and covered mouths. The Whitmores' expressions shifted from polite superiority to deep, startled respect. Daniel's father nodded at me with something like gratitude. His mother blinked back tears. My own mother tried to cut in, attempting to blur the truth. But Daniel stopped her cold. He said he would never forget the eyes that kept him alive. And they were mine. Annabeth stepped beside me, her presence a quiet declaration. I finally spoke, softly but firmly. I said I never needed recognition, only that I didn't deserve to be shamed. The silence afterward told me everything had changed. As the garden slowly exhaled after Daniel's revelation, my mother stumbled back, her breath sharp and uneven. The fear in her eyes wasn't about losing me, it was about being seen for what she had done. She clung to the nearest chair, her face chalk white, the facade she'd protected for decades cracking in front of an entire crowd. Annabeth approached her first, voice trembling as she asked why our mother had chosen to hurt me so deeply for so long. My mother collapsed onto the seat, tears spilling in frantic streaks. Not from remorse, but from the ruin of her spotless reputation. She whispered that she had done everything to protect her image. The words sliced straight through me. Reputation had meant more to her than her own child. Daniel stepped closer, his gaze unwavering, asking if she had cast me out simply to keep her secret hidden. My mother broke, crying out that I had been her mistake. Annabeth flinched as if she'd been struck. I walked toward my mother, meeting her drowning eyes. I told her I didn't need an apology, only the truth, and the acknowledgement she had refused me all my life. I told her I was done carrying her shame. She sobbed harder. But I didn't reach for her. A guest gently held my hand and told me not to let the past bind me anymore. For the first time, I felt free. I left Napa Valley just as the sun began sliding behind the hills, the vineyards glowing in deep gold as though the whole valley were exhaling after the storm. I knew staying any longer would pull me back into a world I had finally stepped out of. The road opened ahead of me, warm with late light, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel weighed down by where I came from. Annabeth rushed out before I could close the truck door. She held me tight, her voice shaking as she promised she would visit, that she wanted to rebuild what we'd lost. I brushed her hair back and told her she had already taken the first step by standing beside me when it mattered most. Daniel joined her a moment later, calm and sincere. He thanked me not dramatically, not for the crowd, but quietly, like someone who understood the gravity of the past we shared. He said if I ever needed anything, he would be there. I believed him. My mother watched from the porch, small and uncertain in a way I had never seen. When she said my name, her voice cracked. I turned and told her I hoped she found her peace, but it wouldn't come through me. Her tears fell, and I let them, driving toward Santa Fe. The sunset washed my windshield in amber. The weight of 20 years lifted with every mile. Freedom, at last, felt real.